Hello and welcome to this IEA briefing. My name is Reem Ibrahim and I'm the Communications Manager and Linda Whetstone Scholar here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Today we have published a paper by Dr. Christopher Snowdon, The Corporate Playbook. It effectively argues that public health academics often argue that industry tactics are uniquely different, when in reality they probably aren't. Chris, thank you very much for joining me today. Could you tell us a little bit about why you wrote the paper?
This is basically part of the work stream I've been working on for a while and will continue for a little while longer about policy making, about public health policy making in particular. You know, economists have got what I think is a very good framework by which we look at policy making, which is basically just looks at people's incentives, public choice theory. It's fairly cynical, but I think that also means it's fairly realistic a lot of the time. But it accepts, I'm sure people have ideological beliefs. Of course they do. That's why you have people in different parties. And you do have MPs who have things that they're really passionate about, but very often they're only going to get a chance to bring in one or two of them in the course of a career, if they're lucky. A lot of the time they just get pushed around, log rolling, rent seeking, all these kind of concepts I think are very important. So we, as economists, we tend to be a little bit cynical about how the policy making process works, but we accept that politicians do things that voters approve of, basically, which I guess is how it should be in a democracy. And then you have loads of interest groups who do things that work in their favor. And the public health way of looking at policy making these days, of which there's a large and growing literature, I think this gets it completely wrong, partly because it's so blatantly partisan, but it essentially just sees all public health policy making issues. And when I talk about public health, I'm not talking about COVID and stuff. I'm talking about smoking, drinking, vaping, alcohol, gambling, and so on. It sees it essentially just a binary fight between the forces of public health, who are clean and pure, and the forces of industry. And this helps them to ignore the consumer altogether. And it kind of even ignores the fact that politicians themselves have a view about this. So if they lose a policy battle, they put it down to lobbying. And that's the end of the question. And if they win a policy battle, it's obviously just because the evidence has prevailed. Now, things simply are not that simple. And one of the rhetorical devices that they've been using more and more is this idea that there is a corporate playbook or a tobacco playbook, and all these other industries follow it. Now, there is such a thing, arguably, as a tobacco playbook, in that in the mid-20th century, when the evidence on the harms of smoking came around, there was a sort of a policy of kind of denying, doubting, delaying, that kind of thing. And that arguably is distinctively tobacco-ish and was then copied by, say, the asbestos industry and the thalidomide industry and one or two others. Some people argue that mobile phone companies are currently doing it now, or that the NFL are doing it in relation to covering up the number of industries in American football. Things like that. That's quite a distinct thing, related really to emerging scientific evidence. What the people I'm writing about argue is that the tobacco playbook involves a specific criteria, which are things like gathering coalitions. So you find people who agree with you and to make your case stronger. And so there's more of you. Lobbying itself, political advocacy, which in the public health literature, when it applies to industry, is described as interference. Critiquing or arguing over evidence, which is a perfectly valid thing to be doing, but in the public health literature is described as mimicking scientific critique, as if it's not even a legitimate thing in the first place. And none of this really stacks up. And what I say in the little book is that these are just the everyday political activities that literally anybody who is involved in politics will have to engage in at some point. You will use the media. You might commission research. You will certainly try and do some lobbying. You might hold public events. Everyone does this, including the public health people. The public health people do it just as much as the tobacco industry or the alcohol industry or the baby infant formula industry. And it's kind of funny because you look at this emerging literature on what they call the commercial determinants of health, and how these evil industries behave. And every time they find a new industry to look at, whether it's the motor industry or the oil industry, they find they're using the same things. Wow, isn't that amazing? How many industries are using the playbook? And the answer obviously is all of them. All the industries use a playbook, and so do all civil societies, and so even would individuals if they're involved in engaging in the policy making process. So it's a completely fatuous description of just everyday political behavior, which is not considered underhand or devious when the public health people do it, or when some supposedly benign industry does it, but is considered particularly pernicious when the alcohol industry or the gambling industry do it. And the reason I think they create this false narrative is because the tobacco industry's got such a bad reputation. They want policymakers to think of every other industry that these people disapprove of in the same terms and lock them out from the policy making process because they're using these dirty, filthy corporate playbook tactics.
What's so interesting about this is effectively that this is just general public affairs. Like, this is just the way in which these kind of political actors engage in the policy-making process, and it isn't unique to these industries, or at least the language they're using often when they're talking about this kind of thing. So I think you mentioned a couple of examples, the difference between advocates and professionals, or particular people that are sort of using corporate actors or other kind of negative words, negative connotations. And so a lot of it is actually just the language that they're using, but down to it, the tactics are the same. Could you tell me a bit about what the corporate playbook actually is? What are they saying these sort of tactics actually are?
In the literature, which has only been around for about 10 years, they've kind of settled on a certain number of tactics. They've moved a couple out over the years because they really don't even fit, like the alcohol industry or something. But I mean, I can't remember the names off the top of my head. There's 5 or 6. They're all pretty obvious. It's using the media, commissioning research, which public health people do all the time if they're not doing the research themselves. It's lobbying. It's holding public events. It's what they call constituency fragmentation, which just means attacking the opposition, which, by God, the public health lobby do that as well. I give an example in the paper of Action on Smoking and Health doing this in just before the smoking ban in 2007. I look at all these supposed tobacco industry tactics and give examples of Ash doing exactly the same thing. And there's no reason why they shouldn't do. It's perfectly reasonable because, as I say, everybody would do it. There was a study in the BMJ just last week, so this is after this paper went to press, a classic example of this, right? So this BMJ article written by someone who used to work for the Daily Mail was moaning about the advertising industry lobbying against bans on advertising so-called junk food, and local authorities supposedly being intimidated by this lobbying and not bringing in bans on advertising burgers on bus shelters and stuff like that. So there's a growing number of local authorities who are introducing these bans, but they can only do it on the council-owned advertising space. But there is quite a bit of that. And this article explicitly says we've got the advertising industry, not even the food industry, right? Just the people like JD Deco, whatever they're called, the people who own the space, aren't very happy about this advertising ban because quite obviously they're going to lose money if a whole bunch of adverts can't be shown. And so this article says that the advertising industry is using the tobacco industry playbook of deny, dilute and delay. Okay, this is supposedly what the tobacco industry did. So the denial is just arguing with the evidence. So if you say, we don't think that, or if you say there's no real evidence that banning burger adverts on bus shelters actually reduces child obesity, you are denying it, right? Because it's not like there can be a legitimate argument about it. And it's quite funny in the article, they say that these groups have said that in London, which did ban these adverts in 2019 on TfL, they say that some of these devious lobbyists have been claiming that rates of child obesity rose in London after this ban, and in fact rose faster in London than anywhere else in the country. Now, this is true, and the BMJ doesn't even attempt to deny that it's true. It just complains that these people have pointed out, which seems like a reasonable thing to point out if you're claiming that this kind of ban will actually reduce obesity. So that's the denial.
That's the opposite effect. It's actually increased obesity.
No, that's just denial, and that's a tobacco industry tactic. And there's diluting it. So diluting it is, even with this ban, McDonald's can still advertise chicken nuggets, okay? Because chicken nuggets actually aren't that high in fat, sugar, or salt, which is the definition of junk food for these people. There's a very kind of meticulous, but also very fussy definition of high in fat, sugar, and salt. It's actually not that easy to make food that isn't high in fat, sugar, and salt. However, McDonald's have achieved it with their chicken nuggets and even with their fries. Now, whether this is because McDonald's have reformulated these foods, I don't know. But one of the purposes of these advertising bans, supposedly, is to encourage reformulation. So if McDonald's have reformulated these things to make them less fatty or less salty. They've done exactly what these public health people claim to like doing, but now they've done it and they can advertise, and they're still furious. So they're claiming this is diluting the policy. Well, the McDonald's didn't set the policy.
Yeah.
The definition behind
they're following the law.
Yeah, they're complying with the law. Yeah, and they're being portrayed as using some kind of loophole. So that's diluting the policy. And then finally, you've got delaying it, which is the evidence for this is that in some of these local authorities where this ban has been introduced, the council is signed up in a contract with these companies for years to come. So they can't actually stop McDonald's advertising until like 2029 because the council has voluntarily engaged in a legally binding contract with McDonald's. But somehow that's McDonald's delaying it. And so what has any of this got to do with the tobacco industry? Did the tobacco industry use any of those tactics? Well, not really, other than kind of arguing about the evidence. It's got nothing to do with the tobacco industry. Yeah. It's just rhetoric.
Yeah, it's so interesting, especially when we're thinking about the rhetoric and the language that's being used according to those industries. It's effectively public health activists using language, using exactly the same tactics, exactly the same sort of advocacy methods. But when it comes to the industries that they just don't like, the language completely shifts and suddenly they are using the corporate playbook.
Well, this is a final irony, see, right? Because there is a huge amount of projection in this. They're accusing all these industries of acting like the tobacco industry. In actual fact, what's happening is these public health people are using the AntiTobacco Blueprint, the AntiTobacco Playbook. They're starting by banning advertising on TV. So that policy comes in with so-called junk food in October. Hasn't even come in yet, but they're already itching to ban it everywhere else, just like the anti-smoking people did after 1965 when tobacco advertising was banned on TV. They are following the anti-tobacco blueprint to the letter, despite having for years denied that there was any kind of slippery slope and so on. So there's
mission creep.
It's pure. The mission creep is very predictable, and people did predict it. But these people said, no, just because we're doing this to tobacco doesn't mean we do it to food. That would be crazy. The slippery slope is very real. They always denied it. And I think this accusing other industries of following this kind of fairly mythical...
It's part of their playbook.
It's part of the playbook, but it's also projection because they know deep down actually what they're doing is following a very clear playbook and they're applying it to every industry they can think of.
It's so interesting, actually, that they are using the exact same tactics they have done for other products, especially when it comes to tobacco. And it is interesting, especially because a decade ago there was that denial that that it's only going to be for tobacco, it's only going to be for these products, and it won't go any further. I mean, same thing with the outdoor smoking ban, with the fact that beer gardens effectively aren't going to be able to to smoke in those areas. They're saying, well, it's not going to happen now, but it will eventually happen at some point, and there will be a time where it will happen. So the mission creep and the slippery slope has happened, and we are continuing to slide down it. What was interesting is you referenced a meta study from 2023 called "Public Health Advocacy Strategies to Influence Policy Agendas," and it looked at 65 different studies related to different trade policy, and it mentions activities that fall within 4 of the 6 that one of the first papers outlined in this so-called corporate playbook. Yeah. So again, there are countless studies that show.
And they do. To be fair, I think in that study they kind of acknowledge that, but they just give it a passing mention and say, actually, these are the same tactics as we accuse the tobacco industry using. But that's probably just because these public health advocates are trying to play the industry at their own game.
So it's fine when they do it, but not fine when the corporate industry do it. That is interesting. So what do you think the future is of this kind of academic literature? Do you think that it's abundantly obvious that these are not any different? These are just tactics that are being used by people that are engaged in the policy making process, or do you think this will they will continue just to deny that they are?
I don't think it's bad that I've written about saying this load of nonsense is really going to derail them. They've got a huge amount of grant funding to continue this pseudo academic stuff, but it's anybody who uses a phrase tobacco playbook or commercial determinants of health should be a red flag for normal people, knowing that you're not really dealing with anyone who's seriously interested in understanding the political science of this. This framework, this taxonomy, it has no predictive power whatsoever. It's never going to give you any insight into how or who is going to win, who is going to win any of these policy battles or why. It's meaningless. It is itself just part of the activism. It is itself part of the tactics.
It's just the way in which incentives are used and the way in which the policy making process occurs. Chris, thank you so much for joining me today, and thank you to all of you for watching and listening. If you would like to check out the Corporate Playbook, I would really recommend reading it. You can check it out on insider.iea.org.uk. Thank you.